And for the last couple of years, we have focused on looking at how we can, leverage our resources and our knowledge in supporting families and parents that are working with children that are in the foster care system, and especially the children. And so we have just really been fortunate in having dynamic, outstanding scholars that are sharing their expertise, their experiences, their passion with us. So I just want to say thank you to the professionals and to the families that are participating in this experience with us. Just know that we are all family and we're working and learning together and supporting each other together. So, and I am glad that Janice and Susan have taken the lead with this project and have done an outstanding job in connecting us with the expertise that they have. So without further ado, I will introduce Janice, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. And those of you that are on the call after the presentation, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. So just to reiterate, for those of you that are in need of CEUs, please put your name in the chat so we can make sure that you get the certificates that you need. And we will have 10 minutes following Dr. Jones' presentation for you to ask questions. So as Dr. Susan Pratt said earlier, that this is our final session of our Recruitment and Retention of African American Foster Parents webinar series. And everyone is right, it has been a great experience and everyone agrees that we've gained a wealth of knowledge in that. So when I think about our kinship placement, where we had Dr. Tara Jordan from Iowa State University, along with Andrea Decklau from Iowa 360, we had Tamara Bibbins, who's a private clinician, and she spoke on trauma. And then we had Dr. Goins Fernandez from the University of Iowa Hospital and Clinics, and she spoke on education. And tonight, we are excited to present our final speaker in this series, and that's Dr. Brandon C. Jones, recommended by Dr. Susan Prattis. Dr. Jones is a practicing clinician, and he describes his practice as, quote, a place where people heal from traumatic experiences and navigate major life transitions. So in addition to his clinical practice, he serves as core faculty and director of field placement of graduate counseling programs at Regis College. He is also a research affiliate at the Center of Anti-Racist Research at Boston University. His scholarship interest lies in understanding how people resist white supremacy and patriarchy while also striving for connection. He is currently working on a qualitative research project exploring how interracial partners navigate race and gender norms. His previous research focused on the experiences of African-American counselors in predominantly white settings. So during our e-dialogue, I was able to learn more about Dr. Jones. So he was able to share why this work is so important. And I felt I needed to share that with you tonight. He stated, because racism is a vector, it has momentum. This makes neutrality an impossibility. So unless we are actively learning, loving, and living in anti-racist ways, we are colluding with racism. We choose what future generations will inherit, end of quote. I felt that was a powerful statement. So our speaker this evening on the topic, Anti-Racist Parenting, Supporting Attachment and Mental Health, is Dr. Brandon C. Jones. Dr. Jones, welcome. We're glad to see you tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you all. Thank you for your gracious introduction as well. I know that we're here for a good time, for a meaningful time, but not necessarily for a long time. So I will share my screen with you in a moment and begin. Yeah, let's get to it. All right. So let's see here. So, share. So fingers crossed you can see my screen. I see a thumbs up? Okay, awesome, great. And so again, just thank you so much for such a warm welcome. It's an honor to be with you. We're going to be exploring the connection between attachment and overall well-being, while also talking about some of the common disruptions to attachment that are often experienced by adopted youth within transracial contexts. And we'll also additionally talk about some of the common parenting traps that are often faced by caregivers in transracial families, and how some anti-racist strategies might promote overall well-being for everyone involved. I will also say that just in terms of my own style, I guess, as it were, if I ever have a choice between talking at folks and talking with folks, my great preference is always to be talking with folks. So I really encourage us to think of the time after the slide deck as a real dialogue. So don't just think of it as a simple Q&A. Think of it as a way to deepen and to personalize the material in ways that might be meaningful. And so with that, my hope really is that you find this presentation to be accessible and filled with at least some valuable insights that you can use straight away. And so let's talk about attachment and well-being. So the relationship between psychological attachment and well-being has been extensively studied within the field of psychology and counseling, and the findings consistently demonstrate that there's a strong link between the two. For us, psychological attachment refers to the emotional bond that individuals form with others, typically their primary caregiver or caregivers, during childhood. And well-being, at least the construct as we'll be using it together today, well-being refers to a person's overall sense of physical, emotional, and social wellness. And so this is the briefest of overviews of some attachment styles that are important to anchor us in. So research has shown that individuals who form secure attachments in early childhood are far more likely to have better mental health and physical health and well-being outcomes later in life. Secure attachment is characterized by a child's ability to trust their caregiver to provide emotional and physical support when it's needed. This helps them to develop a positive sense of self-worth and resilience. On the other hand, individuals who experience insecure attachment, such as those who may have been neglected or abused in childhood, they're more likely to experience a range of mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. These individuals may struggle with forming healthy relationships with others and may also have difficulty regulating their emotions and their behaviors. The impact of attachment on well-being can also be seen in adult relationships too. So people who are securely attached, they tend to have more stable and fulfilling relationships as they're able to communicate what they want, what they need, and how they feel effectively, and trust that the people they're in partnership with will be able to provide support for them. Contrastingly, people who have insecure attachments, they can struggle with feelings of jealousy, they can struggle with feelings of being abandoned or rejected. And because of these things, they often have difficulty forming and maintaining relationships, as they sometimes struggle with regulating their emotions as well. And so when we're talking about disruptions, youth in transracial adoptions can experience a range of attachment disruptions that may stem from a lack of continuity. And so the continuity can be of cultural or racial continuity, as it can also be a function of experiences of discrimination, marginalization, and even racial identity confusion. So when we're talking about disruption of racial and cultural continuity, when a child is adopted into a family of a different race or culture, if they experience a detrimental disruption of continuity to their identity, it can lead to a sense of disconnection and also a sense of loss. These can often be associated with feelings of not belonging, possibly to their first or their adoptive culture, one or the other. A lack of understanding and support is really about, so when parents who aren't yet prepared to understand and support their child's racial and cultural heritage, they may inadvertently send messages that their culture isn't valued, or that there is some inherent problem that needs to be solved. And similarly, a youth may experience microaggressions and or discrimination from individuals, but also from society on a larger scale. These can lead to feelings of rejection, to fear, mistrust, and those can interfere with the youth's capacity for attaching meaningfully with other folks. And then lastly, some youth may struggle with, because of this sense of racial identity confusion, they may struggle with feeling uncertain about their place in the world and how to integrate different cultural and racial identities. And so let's talk a bit about the relationship between racism and well-being. So very briefly, right? So white supremacy and racism, as you likely know, can have profound negative impacts on well-being, both at the individual and also the societal level. And so some examples of this, right? So mental health. So racism and white supremacy can lead to chronic stress, anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems for individuals who experience discrimination and prejudice. These experiences can also contribute to feelings of isolation, to diminished self-esteem and self-worth, and negative self-image. Chronic stress caused by racism and white supremacy can have physical consequences too, such as increased blood pressure or hypertension, heart disease, and other kinds of health problems. Additionally, people who experience discrimination may avoid seeking medical care due to either previous experiences of being maltreated, abused, or neglected by the medical system, or they may fear that they may experience those things, which leads to avoidance of medical care that's needed, which can lead to untreated health conditions and ultimately poor health outcomes as well. And then racism and white supremacy can also create social isolation and exclusion for individuals from marginalized groups. This isolation can lead to a lack of social support and reduce opportunities for positive social interactions, which we know are reduced with worsened health outcomes and diminished overall well-being. And then, of course, systemic racism can limit economic opportunities, of course, too, for people from marginalized communities, which leads to financial instability, increased stress, and these things intersect with some of the other health outcomes that we've already mentioned. And then certainly individuals who have experienced racism or supremacy may also experience race-based trauma too. This can be anything from like the psychological impacts of trauma, such as hypervigilance, physiological arousal or withdrawal, behavioral disturbances that interfere with ordinary functioning. It can also be people experiencing negative impacts of other people or systems acting in race-based ways, such as violence that's from racism as well. And so with these, sorry, I didn't change the slides, there we go. And so with this in mind, the idea that racism can impact both attachment and well-being, I'd like to zoom in some more on the ways in which the insidiousness of racism can play into some common parenting traps. So this first one that I want to talk about is around colorblindness. So what do we mean by that? So overall colorblindness can result in caregivers failing to recognize and value the unique cultural experiences and identities of transracially adopted folks. And so it's important that caregivers acknowledge and celebrate racial and ethnic identity while also being aware of the unique challenges that may come along with people's lived experiences. And so some of these facets of colorblindness to be on the lookout for are, first, ignoring or minimizing race. And so a caregiver might choose to ignore a child's race or ethnicity entirely, really hoping to create a kind of colorblind family environment where everyone is treated the same, irrespective of their background. And the issue with this kind of approach is that it ignores the important cultural differences that impact identity and experiences. This may also manifest as treating multiple children the same without recognizing that the unique experiences have an impact on how they've come to understand themselves and the world around them. It also may mean that a caregiver's care may not be tailored to the specific cultural needs of their child. So in terms of failing to address racism, a caregiver who takes a colorblind approach may also fail to address racism and discrimination that a child may experience, sending a signal that their experiences are unimportant or non-existent, which can then in turn leave a child feeling under or unsupported or invalidated in their experiences. Avoiding discussions about race altogether is an issue because it can similarly convey a message that a child's experience is either invalid or it's really confusing and not being able to have a safe, contained, reliable space where one can disentangle all of the confusion can perpetuate continued not just confusion about what's happening on the outside, but what's happening on the inside in terms of identity as well. The next common trap I want to focus on is tokenism. And so overall, tokenism can result with a caregiver failing to fully embrace and celebrate the unique cultural background and identity, reducing the cultural background and identity to like a symbol of their racial or their ethnic group. And so what do I mean by this? What are some examples? So overemphasizing the child's race or ethnicity. So a caregiver who engages in tokenism may overemphasize their child's race or their ethnicity by focusing solely on their cultural background without acknowledging other aspects of their identity. This results in stereotyped behavior and reduces one to a single aspect of the totality, the wholeness of their identity. Another example is expecting the child to conform to cultural stereotypes. And so a caregiver who engages in tokenism may expect their child to behave or act in ways that are actually based on stereotypes of a particular cultural ethnic background. And this can result in a youth feeling pressure to conform to stereotypes, or feeling like their particular identity or way of expression isn't accepted by their caregiver. Along similar lines, focusing on superficial aspects of culture is a form of tokenism whereby typically physical or easily or highly visible aspects of a culture become the entire representation of a cultural background. And not only does this invalidate youth's cultural experiences, but also it can, for youth who are trying to develop a sense of their own identity and own connection to a larger historical cultural background, it can inhibit this, promoting a shallow understanding of a child's cultural background and or identity. And as I mentioned before, ignoring a child's individual experiences and preferences, it assumes really that a child's individual experiences and preferences are solely a product of their racial or ethnic background, which of course completely ignores individuality as well, and can lead to feelings of invalidation or misunderstanding. And then the last sort of example of tokenism that feels important to acknowledge, which is unfortunate but sometimes real, is that a caregiver may have a secondary or personal gain by touting some superficial marker or indicator of a child's cultural background. And so this might be done for social approval or financial benefit or other kinds of access to power that can ultimately result in a youth feeling objectified or even reduced to some kind of symbol. The last track that I want to focus on, and I'm aware of the time and our need for having ample time for discussion, so I'll pick up the pace a bit here too, is around overcompensation. And so overcompensation can result in a caregiver overcorrecting for potential racial or cultural differences between themselves and their child, which can make the child feel like they're not fully accepted or understood. And so here are some examples. So first is overemphasizing the child's culture. So a caregiver may overcompensate by overemphasizing cultural background, such as making a big, so an example might be making a big to-do of a particular kind of cultural tradition, food, or holiday without really recognizing its or appreciating or doing the work to understand even its cultural significance, and also signaling that it's important for a child to adopt said practices or embrace them without the opportunity to actually explore. Another example of overcompensation is trying too hard to fit in. And so a caregiver may try too hard to fit in, such as adopting a practice that they may not fully understand again or feel comfortable with. And so one of the major issues, besides the sort of intrinsic cultural misunderstanding there, is that it can come across as really inauthentic and make a child feel like their caregiver isn't fully accepting them as they are, but rather are sort of engaging with some kind of abstract or distant entity rather than a whole entire human. And another overcompensation trap is trying to ignore or deny the racial or cultural differences that actually exist between a caregiver and a child. And so, as alluded to before, right, so like colorblindness, for example, is one of these approaches. And so the issue with this, by denying reality, the signal is that either one, a caregiver cannot handle the differences, two, there are actual problems with the difference, or three, the differences don't matter. And the last common trap that I'll highlight here is one of overprotectiveness. And so in this way, a caregiver may, out of often care, yes, but also anxiety, not allow a child to participate in activities or interact with other people if there's any inkling that there might be some potential threat. And so on the one hand, it's important to keep children safe. But on the other hand, overprotection can limit opportunities and hinder the ability to develop independence and resilience. It can sap youth of the opportunity to cultivate the resilience and these strengths and skills, but also really importantly, when we're talking about the cycle of attachment, it prevents a youth from having the opportunity of experiencing a caregiver as someone who is not only cheering them on as they go out and explore the world, but also as being a safe and reliable and stable sort of home base when they return, welcoming them with wide open arms as well. And so when we're talking about some counters to this, so first of all, right, anti-racist parenting, it supports healthy attachment and promotes well-being by affirming racial identity, by engaging in discussions about race and racism, by addressing actual discrimination and bias, by promoting a sense of cultural competence and fluidity. And so when we're talking about affirming a child's racial identity, it involves really fostering a sense of belonging and acceptance. Really importantly, this isn't a destination, but it's a journey. This is a process. This is an orientation that's rooted in openness, consistency, and warmth. When we're talking about engaging in conversations about race and racism, we're demonstrating that, again, that a caregiver is safe and trustworthy, and that this is valuable not because a caregiver has all of the answers, but that they can be relied upon to help to be safe and to help a youth sort of figure out what's happening around them and come up with solutions that work for them. This can also, in the closeness that can manifest as a function of this openness, can promote feelings of connectedness, which reduces feelings of confusion, isolation, and also serves as a template for future relationships with other folks. When we're talking about recognizing and addressing discrimination, this is less about having all the answers, and again, more about the approach. This says, again, that a caregiver is reliable and can be expected to take on actual problems with courage. And not only does this orientation itself promote attachment, but the orientation too, if it is consistently stuck with, it's likely to promote well-being by reducing the negative impacts of discrimination as effective problem-solving strategies are collaboratively created with. And also, and because of that too, it's likely to lead to an increased sense of overall health and well-being as well. When we're talking about really promoting cultural competence, what we're saying here is that anti-racist parenting, it supports healthy attachment by helping but on the one hand, by parents developing the skills to navigate in different cultural contexts, and then in turn also helping youth develop the skill, the ability, and the confidence to be able to navigate intercultural dynamics. This comes with, this is associated with improved social outcomes, but also it builds confidence, self-esteem, and enhances a sense of strong identity. And then this last piece that I want to highlight before we chat with each other for a while is around personal work. And so in this instance, I'm talking about therapy in groups, right? And so by working backwards in terms of groups, I mean finding other people who share a commitment to anti-racist parenting can really help caregivers to not feel alone and to share their wisdom, but also their struggle with people who are on a similar journey. In terms of therapy, doing your own work is important on a number of levels. So first of all, so there's this saying that you never know when things are going to get knocked off your own shelf, and this is true. It's true in many domains, but especially in parenting, we often are unaware of our own baggage or experiences that may be touched upon, our own tender spots that may be pressed upon when we're parenting. And so having a place where that can be the focus, where we can do the work of understanding the connection between our present experiences or feelings or behaviors and our past experiences, can be invaluable in helping us separate what is our stuff from what's happening in the caregiver-child dynamic. And the other kind of therapy that is worth considering too is potentially family therapy. And so family therapy might be beneficial because it can help members of the family relate in ways that are associated with better long-term outcomes. Because even though people can do their individual work, it often takes having corrective experiences within the safe context of the therapy space to start to learn how to be different with each other as well. And so this is a beginning of our conversation, and I hope that we can now talk more specifically about any questions you have, comments you have, or ways to make this land in more personal ways for you all now. Stop sharing my screen here. Okay. I believe my screen is now off. Okay. Hello.
Hello. So I don't see anything in the chat. So as Dr. Jones has stated, that it's going to be more of a free flowing. One thing, a question that came to me as you were presenting was, okay, so I'm just thinking about the past month and a half. It feels like a lot has happened, is happening, and particularly here in our Des Moines community. We've lost a couple of young people, and it's hurt us. But the other piece is that it feels like all of the social media, so the news, the social media, it never stops. It's ongoing, it's continuous. And so I guess I'm wondering, how do we support our young people that may be in placement in cities, in towns where they are the only African American, and that you may have a foster parent who's there for them, but not understanding all of this other background stuff that impacts how that youth has to interact day to day, being the only one in the classroom sometimes, maybe the only one in the town, or even here in our Des Moines community, which is more diverse than some of our outlining counties. what kind of tools can we give to the youth? And what are some other supports we can give to the foster parents?
Sure. I'm
I
sorry
guess
for
that's two questions, I guess.
there's plenty of questions or sub points in there for sure. First, I'm sorry for the losses that your community has experienced. Like many communities around. And so there are layers. So one layer that you addressed was the deluge of loss, of racism, of trauma that is accessible via social media. So I want to say something about that first, and say that one of the things that in my personal practice, when I'm working with youth, when I'm working with parents as well, and when I'm working with schools, as I encourage everyone involved to actively curate their social media feeds. And so one of the things, without active curation, there is some risk that folks will be bombarded with, in particular, it's images and videos that they're not expecting that can cause substantial traumatic harm. And so being intentional about the kinds of connections that they have online, and even if you're not severing connections sources, but even sort of tinkering with various timeline settings so that you only get some kinds of matter, I think is one thing, right? So I think oftentimes we underestimate the capacity with which we can actually change what appears on our feed. Or if we can't always curate sort of the kinds of things that pop up on our timeline or various feeds, we might also choose to be more intentional about how we interact with social media as well. And so not naive to think that people are going to disconnect from it altogether, although maybe some people might consider it depending on their circumstances, but you might choose when, right? So there are some people for whom, engaging in doom scrolling prior to bed, for example, is a common time. That struggle is a really bad idea, not only because of exposure to these traumatic events, but also because it can interfere with sleep, for example, right? That's compounds the problem. So I would say certainly curating and taking ownership over social media feeds is an underused strategy that I recommend to most folks. In terms of being in communities and experiencing things and experiencing racism and trauma, I would say that the first thing is certainly encouraging youth to, so studies show that even one supportive adult, just one, but literally one supportive adult greatly increases outcomes later in life. And so I would say that while there can be this impetus to, and understandably so, react in times of grief and trauma, that there's also a real benefit to taking some preventative measures by really trying to make sure that we're encouraging connections with one supportive adult at baseline as sort of, your daily vitamin dose, right? So preventative measures, I think that the preventative relationships really matter here. And then I think that when we're talking about supporting our foster families or our teachers or whomever it is, I think that encouraging those folks to, so there are tiers, right? And so when we're talking about triaging, I think that being open as a person who can be spoken to, as an orientation, is one default stance. I think being honest about what one knows and does not know is also really important too in supporting youth, because I think youth, especially when we're talking about adolescent youth, are some of the best nonsense detectors out there. And so being real, being relatable, and being honest about what one doesn't know is a really important orientation. And then committing to finding out information, I think, and doing so in a way that's collaborative, I think is an important sort of follow-up step to that. And also getting one's own support too, right? So no one, we're not meant to be islands. And so certainly reaching out for, adults reaching out to other adults for support is also really important here too. And being really clear about how modeling us and being intentionally and using some intentional self-disclosure about the ways in which an adult might rely on other healthy relationships to find some sense of equilibrium. Some modeling in that way, also, I'd say. And then there's a host of other resources, like online resources, that might be useful too. And I'd be happy to share some of those with you too, via email as well, folks.
Thank you. I was going to ask about those, if you could share some resources that we should be paying attention to, and if you wanted to share any of your own previous work in this area.
For sure. I'll share with you, I'm in process with having some things, both some talks and some writings being released, and I'll be happy to share those along once those are as well. And I'm turning to the site on my external monitor over here, trying to see if I have a quick list here for you as well.
Okay.
And
while you're looking for that, I'd welcome others to ask questions.
Please, yes.
I have a question. I have an opportunity, I have toddlers, and my question would be, how do I prepare them? Their classroom, they're the only students of color in their classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So how to prepare them to create resiliency in them? Themselves are quite sensitive. They have a trauma background, but how would you build resiliency at home?
Thank you. Part of so I missed a little bit of the last part of what you said. So right before building resiliency and sort of a trauma-sensitive classroom, I think you said as well. What was before that?
They're toddlers, and they're the only students of color in their classroom. So how do I make sure they're sensitive? So they're 3 though, but I want to make sure I can build resiliency in them, because they're going to be in many occasions the only person of color based on what, so how do you build resiliency within them? They're very perceptive, but they also are very sensitive. They have a lot in their only 3 years on this earth. They've seen a lot. So
thank you. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old myself. This is a topic that is near and dear to me. And so things we know, right? So we know that that even infants are able we now know that infants are able to express preferences based on race and skin color. We know that to be the case. We also know that that young toddlers are capable of perceiving, I think I don't tell you this, you know that the sense of justice is strong in toddler students. They know when things are not fair also, right? And so the work definitely starts early. So one of my favorite ways of encouraging parents to begin to build not only the skills of navigating this, but also the language, right? So beginning with how do we talk about this? How do you notice the world around you and feel empowered to be able to use language and ask questions about the world around you and to interact with other folks is through day-to-day routines. And so pick your live routine, and there's likely a way to enhance that with grounding in something that's culturally specific. And so bedtime routine, for example, books that encourage toddlers to notice differences based on race, for example, I think it can't be too early. There's one that comes to mind to me right now, actually. Like in the title, it's one by Ibram Kendi. It's a board book on anti-racism, which has numbers and counting, which is really nice. It has pictures, I think, that are appropriate developmentally for toddlers as well. And really importantly, it helps parents to put language to race and to racism, which is really important. So children learn about the world through repetition. And so one of the reasons why I think grounding routines in books, for example, is useful because it's easily repeatable. And it starts to build a common language. And that common language, once children have it, they can then use it to explore and create the world around them. And you'll find that then you'll be somewhere else that's less structured, and it will use their internalized vocabulary and sense of language in the world to kind of make sense of other new and unstructured experiences. And so I'd say certainly grounding in literature is one way. A website too that's really great for cutting edge literature, Young Black and Lit. It's great. It's all about mirrors and windows, right? So making sure that there are windows for folks into various cultural contexts, and also mirrors where folks see themselves reflecting literature itself. That's a great resource. And then I would say, whenever, to the extent possible, working with the systems that our children interact with regularly can be really helpful too. And so, for example, working with daycare or preschool, for example, to whether it's as a guest reader or whether it is encouraging a certain selection for like a book fair, or whether it's suggesting topics for their art curriculum, right? Trying to be engaged in the actual the process of developing curriculum and implementing it can be a really good way of not only supporting your own child, but their classmates too. And normalizing early on that systems and context can be responsive and to various cultures, and that and to expect that, I think. Sort of laying the template early in that way. Or another, and this came up recently for me in a case I was working on, encouraging, like even working with a family and they're involved in a church community where they were, or one of the youth was one of the only children of color, and really thinking about the symbols, visual and written around them, and making and seeing if there was a way to have those modified too. And so, seeing Jesus represented in a hue that was recognizable to them, right? But that makes a profound difference. Not only in normalizing that too, but we're not talking about spirituality, but this idea, right, that one might be that you're in God's image, right? And seeing it reflected visually, that I think that has some meaning there too. And so one of the through lines here is trying to find ways, if possible, of being actively involved in some of the actual structures of the context that children live in. And so that not only benefits children directly, but also when children know that parents or caregivers or whomever are involved in helping to shape their context too, it models the kind of active participation and also the what's possible sort of orientation that sometimes gets squashed out by racism. And so it can have some inoculative sort of benefits in that way. Does that help at all?
Totally helpful. What was the author's name? I was taking notes. You gave an author's name, Ibram Green?
Ibram Kendi, yes.
Kendi.
Anti-Racist Baby, I think,
Okay,
is the name of the book.
thank you.
Yeah. Mhm.
And that last name is spelled Kendi, correct, Dr.
That is-
Jones?
That
Yeah.
is correct. Yep.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Other questions? Other questions? So as we begin to kind of bring this session to a close, any parting words, Dr. Jones, before we bring this to a close this evening?
Any parting words?
And I'm going to add that, thank you, Brandy. She's placed in the chat where you can get that book. Thank you, Brandy.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you. Some parting words. Two things. The first thing is thank you for having me. I'm grateful to be spending this time with you. And it's a brief time, but also meaningful to me. And I don't take it lightly. And I want you to feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, or if I can be helpful to you in any way. Feel free to share my email address. I'm happy for this to be a real connection, and not just one that has to be limited to this brief hour with us together. And then the last thing that I'll say is, earlier you did well to describe how I'm interested both in the intersection of white supremacy and patriarchy, but also connection. And so one of the things that has been consistently true in the research that I've done is that whenever people are moving toward connection, the capacity for healing, but also for resisting the dehumanizing forces of oppression is the strongest. And so I want to name that there is some risk, right? So when we're trying to act in anti-racist ways, sometimes we're going to get it wrong. We're going to miss the mark. We may unintentionally do things that are not ideal, or even sometimes that cause some harm. But even in those moments, I think that the most important orientation is to, one, we want to acknowledge when we've misstepped and we've been wrong, but also to consistently move toward connection. And then if we can do that, if we can sort of keep that foregrounded amidst all of the anxieties and turmoil that happens, we are much more likely to survive and then to thrive as well. And so I'd say keep moving toward connection. You don't have to always get it right. You just got to have, be good enough overall. And so move toward connection.
Well, Dr. Jones, I'd like to say thank you for sharing your information with us tonight. You've given us a lot to think about. And also, if you could put your contact information in the chat, that would be extremely helpful. The other piece is that, again, if there are those of you that are needing CEUs, please put your name in the chat. And I see Emily from Four Oaks is nodding. So we want to make sure that we have that as well. I want to thank everyone that is on tonight. This concludes our webinar series, and it has been a true joy to partner with Four Oaks on that. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, Dr. Jones, thank you. And on behalf of our committee and also Dr. Susan Prattis, we thank you. And we look forward to seeing you again on our next webinar series, and it will be coming out soon. So without further ado, unless Emily, do you have anything you'd like to share before we close out this evening?
No, I just put a big thank you in the chat box. I have just so enjoyed this partnership with you all, and I'm just really grateful for it. So just thank you so much for serving our foster families and bringing all this education to us.
Awesome, thank you. So to all of you on tonight, have an awesome remainder of your week. Keep hope alive, keep moving forward, even in the midst of all this trauma. Our kids are worth it. You know what we've been through the past couple of weeks. So we've got to figure out how to do it differently. Even those that are involved in the system, we've got to figure out how to do it differently and then move forward on it. So thank you again and have a great evening. Good
Take care,
night.
everyone. Good night.
A couple words to Andy.